Morning glory and evening grace, America. I'm Cooke and Hugh in Studio West. One of the joys of the era of podcasting is to listen to an uninterrupted conversation between four smart people. Last week, the National Review podcast, the editors, featured Rich Lowry, Philip Klein, Michael Brennan Doherty, and my guest, Charles C.W. Cooke. Hello, Charles. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. I laughed out loud, which is rare, when you said about the Germans, they should just make cars and shut up. Can you give people a little context for that?
Well, I thought that the reaction to J.D. Vance pointing out that Europe in general, and Germany in particular, has become illiberal on the questions of free speech and democracy, I thought that the reaction was absurd. I mean, the reaction was, in a sense, you can't say that. Well, that makes the point, doesn't it?
It did. It was beautifully done. It was elegant dismemberment. I appreciated it. Second question that follows on the first. I've asked four journalists, and I myself do not know, and they did not know, why Alliance for Deutschland, AfD, is considered neo-Nazi and what scares them about them. I really don't have any idea. Do you?
Well, I think that the Germans, for good reason, historically are hypersensitive, and they've come to believe that any discussion of immigration is intrinsically linked to race, and that any discussion of race is akin to Nazism, which I think is not true. So I think that's the context within which they're designated as they are. But I don't think it's accurate. They don't have my politics. I'm an American classical liberal conservative. But the idea that they need to be verboten on the same grounds as you would ban a German Nazi party is ridiculous.
Well, I think it is ridiculous, but no one ever explains it from the German point of view.
Right.
So maybe there's a lineage. But we were told that about Meloni, weren't we, that the Italian prime minister was coming from a Mussolini-linked party at some point?
That's actually a fascinating point, because this has been put down the memory hole, hasn't it? Meloni, it turns out, is nothing like the person who was described. And she's far more classically Italian as well in her affect and in her politics. I'd forgotten that there was a great freak out over her.
Well, okay. Now I want to go to what I really want to talk to you about. Two things. Last week, you were the first person to say on air that you have a neurosurgeon friend who has noticed an increase in head injuries to teenage boys riding the Class 3 bicycles. Have you had a chance to double back with it? I think that's actually a public service for parents to hear.
I haven't talked to him about it subsequently, no. I'll give him a call later. But yeah, he is greatly worried about it. We see a lot of them where I live in Northeast Florida, especially around the beach. And this number of injuries has increased. And I mean, he winces every time he sees someone riding one without a helmet, which is the stupidest thing you can do. But as a rule, they're not really good for kids, because they're essentially small motorcycles.
They are. And what I want to establish is that injuries to children with those bicycles are imminently foreseeable. So the tort liability for the manufacturers and for the parents and for the schools that encourage them to use those is massive. And the moment that tort liability enters into the American market will adjust. But I don't know that they know that there are this many accidents yet. So I'd love to know from your neurosurgeon friend. Now, the last thing, when you were on last week, I just made a reference to the fact I had begun listening to Evelyn Waugh's Brideshead Revisited. I finished. It's magnificent. I listened to the Jeremy Irons audio book, the 75th edition, which is up there on the screen. You then said, I think it's your favorite novel. Did I hear correctly? And if so, why is it your favorite novel?
Well, a couple of things. First, I think it's maybe the most beautifully written modern English book. The prose is stunning. He later was embarrassed by it because he wrote it at a time of rationing, and he was looking back on the sumptuous 1920s when he was at Oxford and had friends who lived a little bit like Sebastian. And I think he was so envious of that life that he came to write in a style that is very florid. And when he read it in the 50s, he thought that he'd overdone it. I don't. I think it's a beautiful use of language. But I also just think that as a development of character and of a non-in-your-face discussion of the operation of grace. It's a fascinating work, and he set out to achieve that, and I think he did it.
Now, I had a friend who passed away last week, David Allen White, professor of English literature at the Naval Academy for 30 years, always wanted me to read Brideshead Revisited. I never did because it didn't come up on the radar. Now I know it's actually small e evangelical about Catholicism. Do you agree with that assessment?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if you look at, I won't give too much away, but there's a particular scene in which one of the main characters dies. And I think Christopher Hitchens was irritated by the fact that the character in question does not hold on in his disbelief, or at least in his excommunication. He gives in. So Ward certainly thought that there was a logic that progressed towards that religious outcome.
So going back to the podcast, I think it was the most recent one, the same one in which you made comments about Germany. You yourself are an agnostic, as I recall you telling me, but you said some people are virtuous and some people are sinful. Now that's just commonplace language. It's a handle to grab onto. But if one is agnostic, how does one divide? I used to ask Hitch this every week. He was on the show 70 times. How do you actually come up with a moral spectrum if you're an agnostic?
Well, I think we, over time, have developed it as a culture. Certainly, religion has informed it, and I'm not sure that it particularly matters whether or not it's metaphysically true. I think that the Christian ethic has a great deal to offer. I also think that a lot of Western civilization and what we regard as virtuous or moral behavior has been determined over time in non-religious contexts. So I think if you sort of want to talk about the theology of it, I do think that irrespective of whether or not one is religious, I think this is what makes one a conservative, is the notion that there is such a thing as good and bad, and that human nature is constant. To me, that is the key insight, that we are the same people as we were 2,000 years ago. We have the same temptations as we did. I'm just not sold on many of the metaphysical claims of religion, but I think it's force for good in the world, and I'm raising my kids within that tradition.
Well, I knew that. Do you think, as Brideshead Revisited does with Ryder, who you admire, and with Lord Mountmain, that there's an arc for almost everyone when it comes to that faith question, which is well-traveled?
Sorry, say that last part again.
Is the arc of the main characters, Charles Ryder and Lord Mountmain, and Julia, all of them, they all travel the same arc from relative disbelief and rejection to belief.
Yeah, but of course, the people who start the book Catholic go back to it, and Charles no longer has the zeal that he exhibits at the beginning of the book. That I do think happens to most people in life. Certainly, I am a lot less annoyed about the question than I was 20 years ago. I'm a lot more open to the claims and the ideas. I've just never got there.
Now, you are not currently a member of the Catholic Communion, so I'm just curious. It's not morbid to think about the church after Francis. Catholics are obliged to and already have prayed for his recovery, but he's very, very ill. What do you think the church is going to need after Francis, whether it's next week or next year or 5 years from now?
Well, when I lived in England, I can't remember when Benedict stepped down, which year it was. It was before I moved to America. And one of the things that really irritated me about the coverage, just as an observer, was that in the left-wing press in England, they talked about the Pope as if he were a politician. So you would get these newspaper articles, and they would say things like, well, of course, in the 21st century, the Catholic Church still thinks this, and a Pope could come in, and you think, well, that's not really the point in it. It's not running for office. And unfortunately, I think this Pope has at times tended toward that. So I'm told by my Catholic friends that we are not looking at the best potential conclave to replace him with someone that I might like. I don't know enough about that, but the trendiness and the desire to please that this Pope has shown, I think is a problem for the Catholic Church. I mean, I'm not Catholic, but one of the things I do find attractive about the Catholic Church is that it has stood on principle for a long time. It has not become the Anglican Church in England. It has not become like that female priest that we talked about a while back who lectured Donald Trump. If it does, I don't really know what the point in it would be. So the next pope is going to have to recognize what his role is.
It is a decisive moment, not just for the church, but I would argue for the world, given the visibility of the papacy. I'll talk about it. Hopefully it's not a discussion for next week, but the next time. Charles C.W. Cooke on X at Charles C.W. Cooke.